Okay, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. So, my name's Ashley Miller. I am going to talk just briefly here at the beginning. I'm the host of this session, and then I'm going to disappear. But I just wanted to start us off by welcoming you. This is Teaching in the Shadow of 38th in Chicago, establishing safe learning environments for all students. And our presenter is Dr. Claire Kamp Dush. Claire is a professor of sociology and co-director of the development core at the Minnesota Population Center at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She's a family demographer who studies intimate relationships and their intersection with human development. She's the principal investigator of two population health data collections focused on families and health, funded by the NIH. She's also a passionate teacher with a strong focus on active learning. And so Claire's going to do her presentation today. I am going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, pop them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to be sort of monitoring both, and I will kind of bring that to Claire's attention in the moments that we have to do that. And then she's also going to leave time at the end for questions and discussion. If you want to be able to do it that way as well. So the other thing that I'm going to do at the very end is just pop a quick link into the chat with a very short survey about the session, if you wouldn't mind filling that out before you leave for the day. We would appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Claire.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to do a screen swap and get my presentation started or my slides started. So sharing my slides, and then I'm going to start the presentation, and then I'm going to swap, and there we go. Okay, so can everyone see, everyone see my slides here? I'm assuming everyone's really quiet, so hold on one second. Let me try to see if I can see everybody and make it a little bit bigger. Okay, even though I'm the only one with my camera. Okay, good. I see thumbs up, so that's a positive. Okay, wow. So yes, I'm talking about the 38th in Chicago is referring to George Floyd Square. And George Floyd Square is where George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, and assisted by 3 other police officers on May 25th of 2020. And so I just want to establish that. And I work at the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to be talking about my experience and how kind of coping with that and all the other things that have happened this past few years. Okay, so this is a traumatic slide because it reminds you of how wild 2020 forward has really been. So does anybody remember going to a Target and seeing these aisles? I lived in Columbus when the pandemic hit. I'll never forget going to the Target that's on Olentangy River Road. And that I literally couldn't believe it. There was like nothing on the shelves. I was like, what is going on here? It was so weird. And then George Floyd's murder happened. Asian hate increased during the pandemic because of the racialization of the pandemic. So that happened. So there was just a lot of stressors going on during this time period. And as an academic, and I have a project that was all the data was collected during COVID. And at the U is what we call the University of Minnesota, we talk a lot about the impacts of COVID, but we talk a lot less about the racial trauma that was this period. On May 28th, 2020, so 3 days after George Floyd's murder, my family moved to Minneapolis. And so I had accepted a job at the University of Minnesota. I was starting in September of 2020. And so I always heard that the best time to be in Minnesota is the summer. And we had just got our house and we were all excited, and we had been pandemicking in our smaller house in Columbus. And so we were excited about our new house. Unfortunately, we never saw our house before we moved or anything like that. So because the pandemic hit, we weren't actually able to visit our neighborhood. We did everything online. It was really interesting. And then we decided to move May 28th, right after Memorial Day, to Minneapolis and spend our summer there. Let the kids, I have 4 kids. There they are right there in this picture. Let the kids get adjusted. And so that's our first day in Minnesota, that picture. It was so hard to move. I totally underestimated how traumatic that was going to be and how hard that was going to be. So that's a picture we took that day. And then that night was the first day of rioting in Minneapolis. And so I remember thinking like, okay, something's going on. We got here on Thursday. Friday, I tried to go to Target and see this picture of the boarded up storefront. They were boarding up the Target that was closest to my house. And I was like, wow, there's something really going on here. And then my husband and I went to the grocery store to try to get some food because, we didn't really bring food with us. And we got in the grocery store and we were kind of shopping and there was an announcement. This grocery store is closing in 1 hour and will be closed. This is on Friday, closed the rest of the night. And they were starting to board up the grocery store. So it was a really wild time to move here. And also just for us, because we had just left all of our friends and family in Columbus. Like I wept the entire time they were putting our stuff in the truck. It just was like, it was very traumatic. So it was a really wild time. Just to give you some perspective, 38th and Chicago is where George Floyd was murdered. And I have a little, marker here for that. My house is down here at the bottom. And then you can see over here on the right, the university. There's 5 miles between the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and 38th and Chicago. And so this really, it impacted all of us. But for people in Minneapolis, it was a unique impact. And for students at the U, it was a very profound impact. Now, it happened over the summer, so not all the students were on campus, but it was profoundly felt. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my first class that I taught at the U. So I didn't teach in the fall of 2020, my first semester. My very first class I taught in spring of 2021. And this is the class I taught. Sociology, Asian American Studies, 3251W, Race, Social Class, and Gender. So it's a gen ed. It counts for American Studies or Sociology. So that's kind of, that's noteworthy because of the racialization of the pandemic that a lot of my Asian American students were experiencing. That and vicarious trauma through all of the Asian American hate that had been happening and still is happening. Mostly sophomore, juniors, and a few seniors in the class. It was a writing intensive class. It was taught on Zoom, so we were completely remote. I had a graduate TA that was supporting the course. I did a flipped classroom approach. So even whenever I taught online, when I was at OSU, I did a flipped classroom approach and basically just, had students consume material before they do that week's discussion. And the way that I ran this class is we would have one online discussion every week that was a group. So it was within their groups. And then we would have one synchronous class per week where we would do, breakout rooms, and it was all based in active learning. 60 students in the class, so not a small class. Okay. So just to remind you of what spring semester 2021 looked like. Okay, first thing, the insurrection at the Capitol happened right before the semester started. Our semester starts a little later than Ohio State's. Then January 19th, U of M semester starts. March 8th is when the Derek Chauvin trial began in Minneapolis. And, it was all you saw. Like I watched the news. It was all you saw in the news. It was all that we had in the newspaper every day. March 16th, the Atlanta spa shooting, which involved the murder of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, happens in Atlanta. April 11th, Dante Wright was murdered by police officer Kim Potter in a first-ring Minneapolis suburb, Brooklyn Center. And just to contextualize that for those of you who live in Columbus, it's basically like Worthington to Columbus. That's how close Brooklyn Center is to Minneapolis. On April 20th, Derek Chauvin was found guilty in all 3 murder counts after the jury deliberated for 10 hours. I feel exhausted just even going over all of this. And on May 12th, the U of M semester ends. So there was a lot that happened in spring 2021 here in Minneapolis. And I know that a lot of us were experiencing the stress of these events wherever we were. So I want to acknowledge that. So I guess my first kind of question is, because I thought maybe I wouldn't talk the whole entire time. What are your reactions to seeing that timeline? And feel free to drop a comment in the chat or to raise your hand if you want to mention what your reaction is to seeing that. I'd love to hear just an initial reaction to that list. We're such a small group, you could probably just unmute too. Overwhelming, yes, agreed. Yep, very intense. It did feel long, didn't it? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of reaction of feeling overwhelmed. I almost like hesitate to even like talk about these things because it can be so emotionally draining. And it did really happen. It was a lot happening in a short amount of time. It really was amazing and like incredible and exceptional and stressful. Okay. So let me come back over here, get my slides moving again. So my conundrum was, even before the semester started, I'm teaching this class on race, class, and gender. And I want to acknowledge all of my students and help them feel seen, heard, and valued before the semester starts. And how can I do that? And so something that I've been doing, and so this is just a screenshot. I know a lot of us use Canvas here. This is just a screenshot of my start here, welcome to the class module. I usually try to open this at least a week or two before the semester starts, and I quiz them over these materials, like a really easy, like 5-point quiz that's, pretty low stakes. Like literally you just have to look at them to get the answers. And they also write a reflection on this first week of materials. So you can see here this list of things. So I have this welcome to the module. That's just like basically an outline of what the module is going to include. And this welcome to the class is like a welcome video that I sometimes make students and just cheesy and post it up there. And then the materials I'll talk about now. So then there's these materials. That's what their quiz is over. Then you can see their prediction quizzes are just like, you're supposed to take them before you consume the material for that module. And you're supposed to predict what you think you're going to find out. So in here, it might be like, if it was a topical module, what do you think the divorce rate is? And then the idea is that if you predict it and then you find out the real answer, it sticks in your long-term memory better. So it's supposed to help students retain their learning. And then there's the actual quiz over the module. You don't see that in this screenshot. Okay, so this is what was in How to Take the Class. And it's just a video of me like sharing my screen, going over here's a typical week in the class. Here's what it looks like. You'll do this. Small teaching. That's exactly where that came from, Jane. You'll do this part of, you'll do this at the beginning of the week. And then here's what you would do in the middle of the week. And here's at the end of the week. And here's how you kind of like navigate this class. So that's a little video about that. And then I've talked about this at Innovate a few years ago. I don't know if any of you were there, but you can also find this on my blog. But it's just a page about how to succeed in the class, and it just goes over study skills. It's basically like everything I do to get stuff done for the students. And then thanks to my Innovate presentation I did about this like 2 or 3 years, time flies, so it's probably more than maybe like 4 years ago. I now do this as a discussion, because when I presented about this at Innovate, people were like, oh, what did the students tell you that they did? And I was like, oh God, I didn't even think to ask them how they get things done and how they study efficiently and where they like to study. So now I do it as a discussion, and the students get little bonus points for throwing in like their favorite places to study or their tips on how they get things done or how they avoid the, YouTube rabbit hole. So that's this. Then there is a late assignment policy, which basically says, please don't turn things in late and why we should turn things in on time and be responsible. But at the same time, I did have one on grace and grace periods this semester because, it was a really crazy semester and really wild semester. And I wanted students to know that, I could have some flexibility there. Okay, so then this is where I was going to put in this idea that I got from my colleague, Megan Hasselwork at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which I kind of modified and did this a little different than what she did. But the idea started from Megan. I decided to write a letter for students who experience marginalization and those who do not. So Megan had emailed, I think, the students that she thought were not white based on their identities at the beginning of the semester, just saying like, and I think maybe she did this in the fall of 2020, just saying, I'm here if you want to talk and if you're going through things. So I wanted it to be a little broader than that because I don't know, students can experience marginalization for a lot of reasons. So I wanted them to kind of interpret the reasons why they would experience marginalization. So I decided to write a letter for the students who experience marginalization, those who do not, and distribute it before the semester began by putting it into this welcome to the class module. And I was really scared and nervous and vulnerable. I was very scared. I don't know. I mean, I was just scared, like, what are the students' reactions going to be? Are they going to like this? Are they going to be upset? Are they not going to understand why I'm doing this? Like, I was just very scared and nervous about it. And I showed it to the TA and I was scared what she was going to think and scared like what her thoughts were going to be. So I just want to acknowledge that I was scared and nervous and it was really vulnerable and I was scared to do it. But here I am talking about it. So I'm glad I did it. But at the time I was very scared to do this. I don't know. I don't know. It just felt like I'm a white woman. What are the students going to think? I'll talk about what they thought. But I just decided it was too important and I need to get over myself and just do this. It's important for the students to know. Okay. So apologize for me reading a little bit because I know this is small, but I'm going to read this is for students who experience marginalization. And this is what I wrote. Dear students, first you might wonder what I mean by marginalization. And you can check out this article, Marginalization. And there's a link to an article, just kind of give some examples. Groups that experience marginalization include, but are not limited to, those who are not white identified, those who do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth or do not identify in the gender binary, those who do not practice the dominant religion of their society, like Christianity in the US, those who are disabled, those who grew up poor. I'm reaching out as your professor to connect with you with the goal of acknowledging the ways in which some of the course content and assignments may be particularly emotional and psychologically challenging, given that UMN is clearly a predominantly white, cisgender, non-disabled institution, and this class is comprised of mostly white, cisgender, non-disabled students. I myself am white, cisgender, heterosexual, and upper class. I commit myself to work hard this semester so as not to cause harm to those students in my class who do not identify as part of the dominant identities at UMN, while also educating the whole class on topics like systemic racism, colonialism, classism, and heterosexism and its impact on individuals, families, and societies. However, I will absolutely make mistakes despite these efforts because of my privilege, and let me first be clear that I welcome your feedback. It may be hard for you to share it with me when I commit a microaggression, for example, and it may be hard for me to hear it. I might get defensive, but I'm committed to listening to you, and I promise you this, you will make me a better professor and teacher for sharing with me any ways I might offend. One time I had a student, this was actually at OSU, who was one of my favorite students ever, come to my office and she said, I need to tell you something. And I could tell she was hesitant and nervous. And I said, lay it on me, I can take it. And she said, sometimes, and I already have used it, by the way, in this presentation, sometimes you use the term crazy in class. For example, how crazy is that? And for me as a person with mental health problems, including PTSD, I find that offensive. And I was a little taken aback. I didn't mean for that term to be offensive, but I cannot tell her how to think and feel. And I also cannot tell her how to react to my words. She has her own reactions. So ever since that conversation, I've tried to avoid using the word crazy, and I fail miserably all the time. And I already did today, but that's why I'm trying to use wild and other things instead that aren't that word. Other words I try to substitute are outrageous, ridiculous, and foolish. And her sharing that with me has potentially helped me to avoid hurting another student's feelings. And it's hard to have a significant learning experience when you are consistently offended by your professor. And my goal for all of this is for you to have a significant learning experience that I dare say you will remember for years to come. And so that was the intro. And then I also wanted to tell them, so the next paragraph is like, you don't have to tell me though, if you don't want to tell me, like, you don't have to take that on and be the person to tell me that. So I also created a form where they could give me feedback anonymously. Nobody during the semester actually used it, but they could give me feedback that way as well, or they could tell the TA. I just wanted to make it really clear that they could talk to me if I was doing something. And then I also just talked about how COVID-19 was disproportionately impacting people of color, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples, and the poor, how we're in the midst of the global civil rights movements with Minneapolis at its epicenter. The Trump administration was coming to a violent end before the semester started. And so I said, when we're making group assignments, I'll try to assure you that you're not the only person who shares your identity in your group. If possible, even I'll try to create a students of color only group, so there's less burden to educate classmates on racism and less likelihood of being subjected to unintentional racist statements and beliefs, and hopefully creating more space for growing and thriving together. And if that's not their preference, I wanted them to let me know. And I did have one student that knew of color, a Black man that was in a group with somebody that they preferred not to be in a group with. And they told me, and I switched around the groups. And so that did happen where I had one student ask to be moved groups. For any content that feels particularly burdensome for you, I gave them permission to opt out, and we could identify an alternative assignment. And then just clarifying that my door was always open for them. And I often stayed after class, after the Zoom. So like I cleared out my hour after the synchronous class and just kind of stayed online, and people would pop in and talk to me. So that was nice. And just like let people pop in and say hi. And then I also just clarified, I cannot guarantee that our classroom will be a safe space for students who experience marginalization, but I'm committed to eliminating systemic marginalization as much as possible in this space and all the spaces that I occupy at the U. And that's what I said about that. And then I just had a bunch of resources. And this is a great time for me to make an acknowledgement that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. And the university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. And I acknowledge that the university has a complex and layered history. And then just did that. And that was what I did. So that was what I did for the marginalized students. So then I had to do something for the non-marginalized students. Okay, so let's start here. So any reactions to that whole thing that I just kind of said? Okay, thank you. Yeah, it was a lot. Any other? I'll also share some student reactions too, but any other reactions to that? Keisha, would you like to say something, please?
Yeah.
Hi, Keisha, by the way.
It's nice to see you, Claire. I'll just add, thinking about my own experience as a student, I think this is something I would have greatly appreciated, even if I was too hesitant to speak up in class, just knowing that that was available to me, I think is very valuable. Yeah.
I did get emails from students pretty quickly after the semester started about it. And I'll show some of the comments from there first. But I remember one student was like, I've never had a professor do this before. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm wondering what other ways your acknowledgement of your whiteness and privilege informed your pedagogy. Oh gosh. I mean, just the way I designed my syllabus, I didn't want it to be all white people. Like I tried to make sure there was never a week where everybody that was talking to you you're only reading things from stuff produced by white people. That's another way that I'm trying to acknowledge it. Yeah. That's the way that comes to mind immediately. And then just being careful of my language and, positioning myself anytime I talk about anything is another way, and trying not to assume students' races, trying not to assume students' gender identity, trying not to assume students' sexual identity. Those are just things that I've been working on and trying to do in the classroom, to acknowledge students where they're at. I made both students I made them both available because I think most students did read both letters, and I have a few quotes from students. I think that implies that. And so I wanted students that were privileged to have a different letter, and you'll see how I had some different comments for them. But I definitely got a sense that they both read both letters. Okay. So here's what I said to the students that don't experience marginalization. So for them, I said, same kind of opening about defining it. And then I said, as someone who is heterosexual, white, Christian, highly educated, non-disabled, cis woman, who grew up in an environment where virtually everyone presented, and I think that word presented is important, as heterosexual, white, Christian, non-disabled, and cis. And I went to college and immersed myself in a social network of heterosexual presenting white Christian cis people. I had a lot to learn about my own privilege that has been uncomfortable at times, to say the least. So then I say here, several years ago when I was still at Ohio State, I was confronted about the ways that I was reinforcing structural racism, and it was difficult and painful. Like I had a faculty that I don't have the details in here, but I had a colleague of mine come and talk to me about a student that I was working with that was a Black woman. And I didn't think she should get her PhD because she wasn't doing that well in some of our classes. And the person that was supposed to be her advisor had left. And so there was really nobody doing the research that she wanted to do. Our program had more of like that psychology way of mentoring people, where you mostly kind of become mini me's of your advisor. And so we mostly had, so we didn't really have anybody doing that work. So luckily she had cultivated multiple mentors. And so her other mentor came over and talked to me. And she was like, I'm really concerned we might be losing a Black PhD student. And I was like, yeah, but she's not really doing that well. And she's like, well, how is she not doing that well? I was like, well, she got a B in our child development class, which is like kind of like a bad sign. If you get a B in stats, okay, fine, but you probably shouldn't get a B in child development. And she's like, oh, did you ever tell her not to get a B in child development? And I was like, no, I didn't. She's like, well, how was she supposed to know that was like a rule? Because her GPA is fine according to the grad school. And I was like, I don't know. How is she supposed to know that? And then she goes, oh, well, did you ever? And she like listed off all these other strategies that I could have been trying to help the student. I hadn't done any of them. And then I was like, oh my God, I am totally clueless here. And so that was a come to Jesus moment, like a major aha moment for me. Thank you again to that professor that sweetly called me out. And the student ended up getting their PhD. Eventually, and it wasn't an easy route, but they did it. And also just kind of taught me too, like people get PhDs for lots of different reasons, and not everybody has to get a PhD to become a professor like me. And it was so good. It was really useful. But I was like, oh my gosh, I burdened this other woman of color. So I have it here. I burdened a woman of color in my network as I worked through my feelings and emotions. And she like kind of would talk to me. I'm like, this poor woman, like she has enough shit going on. Why do I don't have to like work through my feelings and emotions with her? But she totally did. So apologize to this wonderful woman who had to listen to me work through my emotions here. And a lot of Black women have to do that. And after this experience, I started to realize all the ways that I reinforce these structures that help keep some people marginalized. So like while she was giving me social support, she probably wasn't working on like a paper. So like I could totally have negatively impacted her career. So here are some examples I gave my students of things I've done. I often assume people are heterosexual. I mix up the names of two of my colleagues who both were not white, that weren't even the same race. I've assumed a student who was Black was less involved in a grad program due to a lack of passion and skill, and not due to my behavior of not reaching out to her. I said to a male student once, you like sports, right? He totally didn't like sports. I've assumed a student who was Black lived in a predominantly minority neighborhood. I also assumed some of my Black students were first generation college students. Where did this come from? It came from structural racism and the way that I was socialized. And that's where all this stuff comes from. And it's completely reinforced at the university. Completely mispronounced my Chinese students' names. Misgendered, used the wrong pronouns with my friend's teenage son. And I didn't necessarily mean to insult these other people, but I did. And these are things that I do. So I wanted them to realize that as they work through the materials, they were going to have a lot of like emotional reactions to these things. And, with a context. And so I said, I'm committed to work hard so as not to harm students in our class who don't identify with the dominant identities, while also educating all of the students without marginalizations on topics like systemic racism, et cetera. And I said the class was going to bring up emotions. And I said, I'm open to processing anything with you if you feel comfortable talking with me. And maybe you might disagree with me. And I'm also open to talking with you about that because, structural racism and all of the things around this have become this controversial topic, unfortunately. And I also said to them, I want you to encourage to use my door or our TA's door if you feel uncomfortable. And I have those resources there. And to be careful not to burden, like I did, those around you who do hold marginalized identities with the emotional burden of giving you social support while you work through your feelings and experiences. It's not the responsibility of the marginalized to educate those of us who are not marginalized. And I've made this mix before, and she never said she minded, but now I ruminate about the burden I placed on her, which I just talked about. And that was extra emotional labor that I gave her. And then I gave them some ideas of programs that they can think about. And if you're struggling with white guilt, I gave them some ideas regarding that because I don't want them to go around and burden everybody, all their friends. And I just asked them to help me create a good environment that would help everybody be seen, heard, and valued, and then gave them a bunch of resources. I think there's actually a third page in here. Yes. And that's what I did with that, with the non-marginalized students. Okay, so same question. What's your reaction to this? And feel free to drop a comment or raise your hand. And I know I see at least one comment. Yeah, exactly, James. Some students may not know what represents them. And then Sarah says, I try to make the students less defensive, so that was good. And more likely to confront their biases. Yes. Okay. So any other comments or questions on what I told the marginalized students? And yes, I'm willing to share these letters. And I was going to look up, I think they're on a Google Drive someplace, but Ashley, I can try to share them with you and then you can share them with everybody else. So, or if I have time, I'll try to find them at the end. We only have we got 23 minutes left, but okay. So let me stop talking. Reactions. Yeah. Multiple identities. I think that's good to talk about intersectionality. Any other comments about this before I move on? Okay. Well, I'm going to show you what the student said. Okay. So I was like, do you guys kind of get why I was scared to do this? So I just felt kind of scared about it. But it was good. It was good to do this. I gotta be honest. That's how, I usually will talk about these things a little bit later in the semester. My usual strategy is to get my students to like me as a really sweet, nice white woman who has a lot of energy. And then I throw it on them that, by the way, I'm racist. That's what I usually do. So this was a little different where I wrote it into a letter to them before the semester started. But I think it was effective. And I think they got what I was trying to say. The way that I always did it at Ohio State is I would, talk about some of these things, but I would talk about it after they kind of got to know me. So that's why I felt more vulnerable about it. I mean, it was vulnerable to do it at Ohio State when I did it in the classroom, but I kind of got used to it and, you just get used to it. But this felt like a little more vulnerable because it was before they knew me. Also, I could have had, so one thing about the student comments, let's just say this. Some of the students who didn't like this could have dropped, right? So there could be selection into who gave me comments. So students who didn't like it could have dropped, and I didn't have anybody say anything negative. So let me just say that, but it could have been all the students that didn't like this dropped the class early on, which actually may not be a negative thing because that helped, that might contribute to creating a safe environment. I don't know. It could be a negative thing if I could have helped them understand these issues more. I don't know. So I will say that I don't know. I have selection into who's given me responses here. Okay, but that said, let's keep going here. Oh my gosh, sorry that there's so much text on the slide, but let me give you a few quotes. Here's some things that Asian women said. Let me just find it in here. They said I was transparent. They noticed that I admitted that I was susceptible to mistakes. They said the messages that went out to marginalized and not marginalized students, the discussion thread where we talked about healthy study habits, I mentioned that, and the multitude of mental health and support resources all contributed to a safe space that learning can occur. And they thought it was very welcoming, and they liked it. Okay, so another student said those articles, okay, so they also talk about both. The most fascinating resources that I found are the two specific articles for students who experience marginalization who do not. Those articles are exhaustive. They explained from the most fundamental question, what does it mean, to the further supporting resources on campus. This is the first time I've had a chance to know the interactivities of people who experience harsher marginalization. This is the first time I had a professor and a TA who provide the whole class with these amazing resources. Those two articles are like a one-stop center for students, no matter with those traumatic experiences or not. The external resources encompass race, gender, class that are across almost all identities. As a member of the U of M's Martin Luther King Jr. program, which since I'm so new here, I still don't know about this. I resonate with the program's mission, and they thought we did a good job helping with that. Some of the Asian men said things too. One of the things that stood out, let's see here. I was surprised there was a specific page designed specifically for students who experience marginalization during this time of civil unrest. Marginalized communities need support more than ever. Another one said down here, let's see here, where was that part at? They also like the stuff about stress. Oh, at the bottom here, outside the study, staying healthy tips. It was very interesting to see the resources addressing students who experience marginalization, those who do not. I appreciated both posts on these topics are not directly discussed very often, and far too many people are oblivious to the fact that different populations experience college or courses in a different way. I'll admit that sometimes I lose sight of this as well. It's a good reminder of me to be cognizant of those who do and do not share similar experiences and backgrounds as me, and encourage myself to understand and learn from both perspectives to see how I can contribute to my own viewpoint as I progress through the semester. A student who was multiple races said, one thing that surprised me was the marginalizations and those who don't. I was surprised. I've never had a professor address these types of identities before. It's refreshing to see and appreciate the extra time you took to both acknowledge it, especially in a sociology class where identities are like this are important to listen to during related topics. As a person of color, it made me feel heard. And I also liked, I suppose you could say drawn to, was the additional materials at the end of the module. I appreciate the organization. So white students liked it too. The white student said, the information for those who have no experience in marginalization was the most interesting to me. It's not deep or interesting, but the transition to online work has been difficult. It's nice to see the effort. I was surprised. I've talked about marginalization in other classes. I never saw it actually broken down into categories. I was drawn to the information given how to combat marginalization. I found it helpful. I want to learn more about how it impacts people's lives. I was surprised by these tabs. I've never had a professor acknowledge students' marginalization or lack of created resources for both students. I read through the tabs for students who don't experience marginalization. I love the professor's examples of the times she was defensive instead of acknowledging her own mistakes. I've done this many times, as I'm sure other people have as well. So those are some examples from the white women. White men also liked it. Of course, these are a lot of these sociology students, so I want to acknowledge that. I've been thinking about my privilege and the fact that I have not been subject to really any marginalization over my life. I hope to be a therapist. I think it's incredibly important to be aware of my privileges. The material in the module was great. So the white male students also liked it. Okay, so is that surprising? I don't know if that's surprising or not. So any comments or reactions to what the students thought about this? Okay, so I just want to talk about a few other strategies that I also use. Oh, have I had a chance to code them? No, I haven't coded them, Kay, and I should probably try to do some actual research on this. This is just from their reflection assignments they did for the semester. And so this is not good systemic research. And part of that is because I have so much other research that I'm working on. So this is more just me using their comments. I would like to maybe evaluate it, and maybe the next time I teach a class and do an actual more formal evaluation. Okay, other strategies used throughout the semester. I began classes with an acknowledgement of what was happening and checking in with students. So just asking students how they feel, how's everybody doing, how's our stress levels, how are we feeling? Reminding students of that how to succeed page. So just had a lot of different resources in there. So I would remind them about that during the semester. Did some deadline extensions. So this is, my TA wrote this in Dear All, in light of the additional stress, pain, and trauma we're all experiencing because of the police murder of Daunte Wright, most especially the BIPOC students in this class. We're extending the deadlines for everything due this week by a week. You will see these new deadlines reflecting assignments. So if you need to, you can take extra time this week to take care of yourselves, cope, and process. We've also removed the asynchronous engage assignment for next week and removed the peer review assignment. So we're just removing some assignments just to reduce the burden on the students. Another thing I did was after the Atlanta spa shootings, I had a self-care hour class. So I canceled the synchronous class. So I just said, dear students, I want you all to think about what you like to do for yourself for self-care, and then go do it tomorrow during class. This semester has been very difficult for all of us. I want to give you space to do something yourself. I'm going to be in our Zoom room tomorrow at 1 p.m. And if you want to process some more in the specter of racial violence in our country, with a special emphasis on the murders of 8 people, mostly Asian American women, killed in Atlanta last week, I will be here. To all of our students who identify as Asian or Asian American, we are so sorry that you're going through what you are going through and experiencing. Please take this time for yourself to do something that feeds your soul, or come and talk with me tomorrow at 1 p.m. Do whatever will help you the most. And I'm thinking of you all. And if you want to talk, I'll be in our Zoom room. Otherwise, take care of yourself and give yourself an hour and 15 minutes, and don't fill it with other work. So just trying to help them to take a few moments for themselves. And students appreciated that. So that was nice. Okay. And let's see here. So have you tried any? Okay, so I'm going to go through the comments and then let's talk about that. So Keisha says, I'm not surprised. It's something that's not typically acknowledged, and to have it front and center really sets a tone. And for me, I would feel seen, and this is something my instructor really cares about, and I would be more likely to approach them. Yeah, so that was exactly what I was going for, Keisha, whenever I did this. So have any of you tried any of these strategies that I just talked about, and how did it go, and what are your thoughts?
I'll share. And during that year of COVID, being out and all that stuff, I did set up a regular check-in. So in our Zoom class, we just did a check-in at the start of every class session, and I've continued it. It was just like a quick mood check. So I teach mental health classes. So the same thing I would do in a counseling session where are you at today? And we used funny memes and things to kind of, they can pick their what. I also made time at the end of class where I would stay on, like you mentioned, I would stay after class because a lot of times we had difficult topics. And so for those students who maybe didn't contribute as much or didn't have their camera on, they sometimes would process with me after class.
Yeah. And I had that happen a few times too, and I really appreciated that. And I was really glad that I gave myself that space after the class was over to have them come and talk. A few concluding thoughts that I have. First of all, students really liked me in general and the class. And so it did not negatively impact our class. And in fact, the students felt really seen and valued and heard. And they really liked the fact that they felt like, it was in a welcoming environment, like that was mentioned by several students in the teaching evals. And so that was really positive, and especially for our gender, race, and social class where, we're talking about a lot of different things. I appreciated that students really liked the class. And, like this first comment, it was a tough semester because of the social climate and the just unrest that had been going on in Minnesota because of the trial and Derek Chauvin trial and Daunte Wright's death. And students understood that and appreciated me acknowledging that. Another thing, so I don't know how many of you do this, but it's the greatest assignments in the history of assignments, which is having your student make a meme of the semester. And so I always have my students make a meme at the end of the semester representing the class. And so in Minnesota, I'm newish to Minnesota. I also started my job over Zoom here. So that's a whole thing. And we can have a whole entire conversation probably about starting jobs over Zoom. I saw in the chat this morning during the first presentation, people talking about starting jobs over Zoom, and it's been weird. But there's this I was talking to Kay about this. There's these Minnesota nice ideas. And basically, Minnesota nice is like kind of grounded in this idea of passive aggression. So the students really resonated with the Minnesota nice part of it and thinking about the role of Minnesota. And this is from actually two of the white students in the class that made memes. And they said, corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture. And the first one says Minnesota nice. And the second one says passive aggression, covert racism, and the inability to directly confront systemic inequities. And then Pam from the office says, they're the same picture. And then the other one says, pretending to be woke liberals, because, Minneapolis is a very, very liberal city. The people who represent me in Congress are Ilhan Omar, Tina Smith, Amy Klobuchar. And then if you keep going up the chain, Kamala Harris. And then I got one man up there, Joe Biden. So I really appreciate the fact that I live in a very progressive city. But at the same time, we're the same city that's now, murder, or the same place that's murdered two men since May 25th of 2020 by the hands of police. And so this meme is pretending to be woke liberals, Minnesota, and then the woman looking at him, racialized policies that perpetuate discrimination and inequality. I know, there's a lot of conversations here about how do we work on this and what does that look like? And it's uncomfortable, but I'm glad that people are having these conversations, and we'll see how much it actually motivates change from here. Okay. So I just wanted to thank Stephanie Rodiak, Michael Garrett, Jessica Phillips, Melissa Beers, and all of my other incredible OSU colleagues that really shaped, and the Innovate team, and all of the people I worked with at OSU that really shaped my thinking around teaching. And I have my contact information up here if you're interested in that. And then let's have a discussion. So we have like 10, I did actually leave time for us to talk about it. And I'll also mention that I did share this information that we've just talked about with my colleagues in my department, which also felt very scary because I don't know them very well yet. And I shared the letters with them. I didn't really hear much back, which I think is kind of interesting. But I did talk about that I was doing that here. So that's been kind of a interesting experience too. Okay, so discussion, thoughts, comments.
So I run a grant program. We were talking about this before the session started, where mostly we give away money to faculty who want to incorporate affordable content into their courses. But we did start a racial justice component of that program a couple of years ago. And the goal of that is to just help faculty do any number of things to incorporate racial justice topics into their curriculum. And it doesn't have a lot of parameters about what our expectations are, but what we try to do is provide some examples of here are some things you can do. And that's why I was so curious about those letters, because I think it's a really, really good example of, just doing something without necessarily making yourself vulnerable is powerful, right? Yeah. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to provide answers to anyone, right? You can just provide sort of the safety to try to help with their psychological safety. So I think that's why I asked about if you would share those, because I would love to share those as one really important strategy, because I think this work feels like bigger to people, like it's too big, like I don't know how to do this. And so this is a really good example of just, you don't really have to know how to do it. You can just try to make yourself vulnerable. And so I appreciate that, certainly. And I'm definitely going to track those down.
Yes, I'll definitely share them with you. Okay, so just looking over some of your comments from Coach Ferguson. Yes, it was good, and I was glad that I did it. And then let's see here, 2 letters instead of one addressing both groups. I don't know. I guess I did 2 separate letters because I didn't want to do, I guess, first of all, I assumed probably they would look at both because they're both available to everyone. And I guess I just wanted to have the resources tailored to, resources were pretty tailored to both groups. And so I just wanted the students that had more marginalized identities to feel like they were uniquely, I don't know, like I was uniquely open to talking with them and realizing that I wasn't perfect. And for the other students, for the non-marginalized students, I wanted them to have a whole other set of resources. So it felt like it would be too long, even though there were some of the same materials in both, but they were, very different kind of tailoring. And so I guess that's kind of why I did that. And just combining it would probably have been pretty long. And then the resources, I would have had to here are the resources for if you are marginalized, and here are the resources for if you are not marginalized, and they're pretty different. So that's part of that. I wonder if you would do, yes, I'm definitely going to do, I did it this semester again, and I taught a totally different class. This semester I taught this super little bitty baby class called Pop Studies Practicum. It's the smallest class I've ever taught as a professor at a Big Ten university. It was 12 students, and maybe even smaller than that. I have 11 students. And I used the letters again. I would say half of the students in that class had marginalized identities, at least. They either were a student who was not white, or they were a student who was not gender binary, or they were a student who was not, I think those are the 2 prominent identities. And they, again, got emails from students saying, I really appreciated those letters. So that was good. So I did do that again. And if I would change anything, I probably wouldn't change anything that I did. I guess maybe I would need to think about the contextualizing, because I did contextualize it to COVID and to George Floyd's murder, which I think is still impacting everybody here. We have the trial for the other 3 police officers coming up. So I would maybe change that a little bit. And implicit bias test. Yeah, I think I've definitely used those before. I can't remember if I used it that semester. I may have. A lot of the memes were about racism. A lot of the memes were about gender, about sexism too. So students definitely, were realizing that. I do like those implicit bias tests. Those, I mean, like no matter how many times I take it, I come across. So I can't not have implicit bias. So it can be effective. So I can't remember if I used it or not, but I've definitely used those before. I've used the gender one and I've used the race one, both. The gender one's kind of interesting because it's almost about working moms and working families, which is kind of interesting. Other comments? Beth, I saw that you had your camera on for a second and then back off for a second. Did you have anything that you wanted to share?
I was just going to ask my question there, and I realized that I was sitting on my sofa instead of in my home office and realized, oh, shucks, the lighting is terrible now. So I moved to a more proper space. But I wanted to thank you. This is, you've given me a lot to really think about that I'm hoping to apply. I appreciate it.
Yeah. One thing that I will say, if you decide to do this, also feel free, to modify whatever. I'll share it with Ashley, and then hopefully she can get to everybody that was here, and feel free to use it and modify it. If you just cite me for it, please, and Megan as well. And you'll see in the materials that I cite Megan and Nika and myself. But one thing that took a while was all those resources. And like, for example, like a lot of my materials, I had tailored to Ohio State. So I had to redo all of the resources for Minnesota. And it takes a while. There's a lot of resources around. It takes a while to like cultivate them all. And so just a heads up. And, maybe if one of you does this, you could share it with other folks at OSU, if you're at OSU or whatever university you're at, because it takes a while to gather all the resources, but it's really useful once you have that list going. And that was part of the reason why I shared it with my colleagues. Whenever I did it. Yeah. Okay, we're at the 1 minute mark, or according to my timer, about close to a minute. Any other comments or questions or anything else that can be helpful with?
I'm just going to pop the link to that survey that I promised everyone into the chat. If you have time, please fill that out. And yeah, thank you so much, Claire. This was really, really helpful and interesting. And thanks to everyone who came.
Yes.
Enjoyed it. And yeah, if you, we'll make the recordings available probably in about a week or so. And at the same time, if Claire, you can share those letters with me, I'll make those available to everyone as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. And if anyone's listening to this recording, feel free to send me an email, kampdush@umn.edu. And also, Keisha, I have thought about sharing this at the U, but I'm not as clear about how you get to share things. So I'll maybe eventually figure it out if we ever get back on campus.